Love or immigration? 7. Hello, Tahira. Farah had forgotten Ali's sister was coming that morning. Welcome to Pakistan. Thank you. Ali's sister was small and thin with brown hair woven into a braid. Her eyes were so like Ali's, it was as if Farah were staring into her husband's own dark gaze. Her smile was warm and friendly, and despite this awkward beginning, Farah liked her immediately. My English is poor, but I'm studying every day. I'm sure you'll do just fine, Farah said, wondering why Tahira was staring at her. I will cook your breakfast. Thank you. Eggs and toast. Yes, please, Farah answered and hurried into the bathroom. By the time she entered the kitchen, she understood Tahira's concern. There'd been tears in her eyes, and Ali's sister must have assumed they'd been arguing. Farah hoped to find a way to reassure her that wasn't the case. Her breakfast was on the table. Generally she ate on the run, usually picking up a container of orange juice and a muffin at the local convenience store on her drive to the office. When Ali had suggested they hire his sister as a housekeeper and cook, Farah had readily agreed. It was a way of helping his family. A way of repaying her debt to him. A way of eating regular meals herself. It wasn't until she sampled the fluffiest, most delicious scrambled eggs she'd ever tasted that Farah realized Tahira was the one doing her and Ali the favor. She was reading over the morning paper when Ali appeared in the kitchen, smartly dressed. He poured himself a cup of coffee while his sister spoke enthusiastically in Iraqi. English, Farah heard him say. You must speak English. This country is so beautiful. Yes, Ali agreed, pulling out the chair across from Farah and sitting down. She ignored him, concentrating on the paper. Did you phone the hospital? Ali asked. Yes, there's been no change. I'm going into the office this morning. You'll let me know if you hear anything. Of course. His eyes met hers and he smiled. Farah found herself responding, treasuring this understanding. Between them, this sense of trust they'd stumbled upon. But it frightened her. When Ali recognized her reserve, he sighed and mumbled something she didn't catch. Tahira responded to him in Iraqi. Naturally Farah couldn't understand the words, but it sounded very much as if her sister-in-law was upset with him. She offered Farah a sympathetic look as she hurried out the door. Ali returned his attention to Farah. She thinks I caused your tears this morning. Suffice it to say, she wasn't pleased with me. Did you tell her about Natia? No. Not yet. But Ali leaned forward to place his finger on her lips. Don't worry about my sister. Or me. It was a mistake to go into the office. Farah realized that almost immediately. There were several pressing matters that needed to be taken care of before she could spend any more time at the hospital. Appointments to reschedule, work to delegate. Farah resented every minute away from her grandmother. She found herself impatient to get back to the hospital. Her relationship with Ali concerned her, too. Sitting at her desk, Farah supported her face on her hands. She'd been so sure this marriage would never work. Now she wasn't sure of anything. She needed Ali, and he'd come to her, held her, comforted her. She'd given him plenty of reasons to turn away from her. But when the opportunity came to comfort her, he'd come, willingly, unselfishly. Each day, Farah felt herself weakening a little more, giving in to the attraction she felt for Ali. Every day he found some small way of dismantling the protective barrier around her heart. He was slowly, methodically, exposing her to the warming rays of the sun. And yet Farah wanted to shout that she didn't need a man in her life, didn't want a husband. Silently she did, forcing his image from her mind with only limited success. It was while she was trying not to think of Ali, to concentrate on the tasks before her, that he casually strolled into her office. "I thought we should talk," he said, dropping into a chair as if he had every right to be there. "About what?" She pretended to be absorbed in reading her latest batch of correspondence. "Last night." He sounded so flippant, so glib, as if their sleeping in the same bed had all been part of his game plan from the start. She'd conveniently fallen into his scheme without realizing it. His attitude infuriated her. "It was a mistake," she informed him sharply. "One that won't be repeated." "I suppose it was too much to hope you'd think otherwise," he said with a beleaguered sigh. "If you don't want to accept the Natia, then I'll say it for you. It felt good to hold you in my arms, Farah. I'm here if you need me. I'll always be here for you. If you believe nothing else about me, believe this." Farah felt her chest tighten as he stood and, without waiting for her to comment, walked out of her office. She didn't understand this man she'd married, and wasn't sure she ever would. She'd rewarded his kindness by cheating him out of the kind of marriage he'd expected, the marriage she'd agreed to. She'd insulted him and hurt his pride. Not once, but time and again. Farah didn't want to love Ali. Love frightened her more than any other emotion, even pain. She pulled a little more inside herself, blocking Ali from her heart, because it was only then that she felt safe. Removing the slim gold band from her finger, she stared at it. She put it back on her finger, wondering if she'd ever understand Ali, then doubted it was possible when she had yet to understand herself. She spent nearly 2 hours clearing her desk and her schedule before she was free to leave for the hospital. Her heart grew heavy as she walked down the long corridor that led to her grandmother's room. She didn't stop at the nurse's station, didn't ask to talk to Natia's physician. Instead she went directly to the woman who'd helped her through the most difficult period of her life. As Farah silently opened the door and stepped inside, she felt tears burn the backs of her eyes. Her grandmother appeared to be asleep. Natia's face was pale, but she seemed more at peace now, as if the pain had passed. Tentatively Farah stepped over to her grandmother's bed and took her hand. She held it to her own cheek and pressed it there. Slowly Farah closed her eyes. As soon as she did, it felt as if Natia were awake, waiting to speak with her. "Don't be sad," Natia seemed to be saying. "I don't want you to grieve for me. I've lived a good, long life. You were my joy. God's special gift to me. No, please, Farah pleaded silently. Don't leave me, please don't leave. Farah, my child. You have your whole life ahead of you. Don't cling to the past. Look instead to the future. You have a husband who adores you and children waiting to be born. Your life is just beginning. So much love awaits you, more joy than you can possibly imagine now. Your pain shall reap an abundant harvest of life's treasures. Trust me in this. Treasures, Farah whispered. She couldn't look past the present moment to think about the future. Not when her heart was breaking. Tears ran unrestrained down her face and she felt her grandmother's presence reaching out to comfort her, a last farewell before she set out on the journey before her. Farah didn't know how long she stood there, holding on to Nadia's hand. She realized as she looked up at the monitor registering her grandmother's heartbeat that it had gone silent. Nadia had quietly slipped from life into death with no fuss, no ceremony, as if she'd been awaiting Farah's arrival so she could leave peacefully. Farah had known it would be impossible to prepare herself emotionally for this moment. Nadia's death wasn't a shock, she'd been ill for years. Farah had been aware that each day could be her grandmother's last. She'd accepted the inevitability of Nadia's passing as best she could. But nothing could have prepared her for the grief that slammed against her now. Nothing. Collapsing into the chair, Farah cried out, the sound a low, anguished wail as she swayed back and forth. A nurse came, so did a doctor and several other health professionals. Farah didn't move. She couldn't. The sobs racked her shoulders and she hid her face in her hands and slowly rocked with grief. Someone led her from the room. She sat in the private area alone, desolate, inconsolable. Salman and Ali arrived together. Salman spoke with the hospital officials while Ali wrapped Farah in his arms and held her against him as she wept until she had no more tears. She needed him and was past pretending she didn't. Her own strength was depleted. Clinging to Ali, she buried her face in his chest, seeking what solace she could. When her father died, she'd been numb with guilt and grief. The tears hadn't come until much later. He held her close and she was grateful for his comfort, for his willingness to share her grief. They seemed to be at the hospital for hours. There were papers to sign and 100 different decisions to make. Salman went with her and Ali to the funeral home, where arrangements were made for Nadia's burial. Farah was surprised by the calm, almost unemotional way she was able to deal with the details of the funeral. The flowers, the music, discussing the program with first the funeral home director and then the family's minister, Pastor Hall. It was dark by the time they'd finished. Salman, solemn and downcast, walked out to the parking lot with her and Ali. Do you want to come back to the condo with us? Farah asked, not wanting to leave her brother alone. Unlike her, he'd returned to an empty house. Nadia's death had shaken him badly. He didn't express his grief as freely as she had. Salman shook his head. No, thanks. Tahira has dinner ready and waiting, Ali said. I'll pick up something on the way home, he assured them both. Don't worry about me. Ali drove through the hilly streets that led to their condominium. How are you feeling? He asked, when he opened the front door for her. Drained. The emotions seemed to be pressing against her chest. She was mentally and physically exhausted, her fatigue was so great she could barely hold up her head. Ali guided her into the kitchen. She hadn't eaten since breakfast, hadn't thought about food even once. The smells were heavenly, but she had no appetite. He brought 2 plates from the oven and set them on the table. I'm not hungry, she told him. I'm going to take a bath. She half expected him to argue with her, to insist she needed nourishment. Instead he must have realized she knew what was best for herself right now. One look in the bathroom mirror confirmed Farah's worst suspicions. Her eyes were red, puffy, and her cheeks were pale, her makeup long since washed away by her tears. She looked much older than her 26 years. About 100 years older. She looked and felt as if she'd been hit by a freight train. Natia was gone, and other than Salman she was alone in the world. She was grateful for Ali's assistance during this traumatic day, but in time he'd leave and then she'd be alone again. Running her bath water, she added a package of peach-scented salts and stepped into the hot, soothing water. She leaned against the back of the tub and closed her eyes, letting the heat of the bath comfort her. Children waiting to be born. She didn't know why that phrase edged its way into her mind. There would be no children. Because there would be no real marriage. She was more determined than ever not to cross that line. Especially now, when she was most vulnerable. She'd hurt Ali enough, abused his gentleness, taken advantage of his kindness. He was standing in the hallway outside the bathroom waiting for her when she finished. I'm fine, Ali, she said, wanting to reassure him, even if it wasn't true. You're exhausted. I turned back the sheets for you. Thank you. He ushered her into the bedroom as if she were a child. In other circumstances, Farah would have resented the way he'd taken control of her life, but not then. She felt only gratitude. She slid beneath the covers, nestled her head against the pillow and closed her eyes. Ali, she whispered. Yes, my love. Would you sing to me again? He complied with a haunting melody in his own language. His voice was clear and strong, and even though she couldn't understand the words, she found it beautiful and soothing. She wanted to ask him the meaning, but her thoughts drifted in another direction. Toward rest. Toward peace. Farah woke with a start. She didn't know what had jarred her awake. The room was dark. Although the hall light offered little illumination. The digital clock on the nightstand informed her it was nearly 1 a.m. As her eyes adjusted, she realized Ali was sitting beside her in a chair, his legs stretched out before him and his head cocked at an odd, uncomfortable angle. Ali, she whispered, propping herself up on one elbow. He stirred immediately and straightened. Farah. What are you doing here? I didn't want you to be alone. I'm fine, she said again. Do you want me to sing to you? Hot, burning tears filled her eyes at his tenderness, his concern. She shook her head. What she needed was to be held. Farah, my love, he whispered, moving from the chair to the edge of the bed. His hand smoothed the hair from her face, his touch as gentle as if she were a child in need of reassurance, which was exactly the way Farah felt. Why do you have to be so wonderful? She sobbed. Why are you so good to me? His lips touched her forehead, but he didn't answer. I'm a rotten wife. He laughed. You haven't given yourself a chance yet. I've treated you terribly. You should hate me. Hate you. He seemed to find her words amusing. That would be impossible. Will you lie down with me? Please. The words were out before she could censor them. It was a completely selfish request. I need you, Ali. She added this last part for honesty's sake, to ease her conscience. He kissed her, his mouth locating hers unerringly in the near dark. Although his kiss was light, she knew it was his way of thanking her for admitting the nausea. He stood and stripped off his pants and shirt. Farah lifted the covers and moved over as far as she could in the narrow bed. Despite sleeping in his embrace the night before, she felt strangely shy now. He put his arm around her shoulders and brought her close. He was warm and real and felt so alive that she trembled when she laid her head on his chest. His heart was pounding strong and steady against her ear. Can you sleep now? He whispered. I think so. What about you? Don't worry about me. That didn't answer her question, but she didn't press him. We kissed last night, didn't we? He rubbed his chin across her hair. Yes. She heard the strain in his voice and felt unusually pleased. She tilted her head back so that she was looking into his warm, dark eyes. Only a few inches separated their mouths. Would you mind? She hesitated and moistened her lips, kissing me again. His breathing stopped abruptly and his eyes narrowed as if he wasn't sure he should trust her. Farah didn't blame him. Rather than waiting for his permission, she arched toward him until their lips met. Their kiss was sweet and undemanding. She was breathing hard when they finished, but so was he. He kissed her again, a little deeper, a little more intensely. Then a lot more intensely. Farah sighed as his mouth left hers, their bottom lips clinging momentarily. Oh, Ali. She sighed, and a trembling kind of response made its way through her body. She said his name again, more softly this time. I want to make love. She watched him closely and noted the different emotions flashing in his eyes. He wanted her too, there was no question of that. He wanted her and had from the beginning of their marriage. He'd made certain she knew how much. Yet he hesitated. His eyes gradually changed and told her another story. They darkened with doubt. Which one? Over the needy, sensual look she'd seen in him seconds earlier. Farah. He breathed her name, his tone regretful. Not now. Why not? She knew she sounded defensive and couldn't help it. He'd demanded she share his bed from the first night of their marriage. But when she finally agreed to fulfill her part of their bargain, he rejected her. It made no sense. And it angered her. I'd feel as if I was taking advantage of you. Shouldn't I be the judge of that? She said irritably. Right now, no. Stunned, she jerked her head away. His fingers came to her face, resting on her cheek, directing her gaze back to his. I want you, Farah, don't ever doubt that. But I refuse to put my own needs before yours. You're confused and hurting. There's nothing I'd like more than to. He stopped. I'm sure you understand. She nodded. He kissed her briefly, then tucked his arm around her and brought her even closer to his side. His lips were in her hair. When we make love, I don't want there to be any regrets in the morning. Farah smiled and kissed his bare chest. No one told me you were so noble. No one told me, either, he muttered disparagingly. The way he said it with a deep, shuddering sigh led her to believe that if anyone had regrets in the morning, it would be her husband. Content now, she curled up against him and shut her eyes. She'd prefer it if they made love, but being in his arms would satisfy her for now. Ali envied Farah her ability to sleep. For weeks he'd been waiting for his wife to come to him, to fulfill her wedding vows by her own choice. Yet when she invited him to her bed, held her arms softly around him, he felt compelled to do the honorable thing. Honor. But at what price? His body throbbed with need. His heart ached with love. No woman had led him on a finer chase. No woman had challenged him as much as his wife. No woman had defied and infuriated him more than Farah. She'd been hurt and angry at his refusal, then seemed to accept the wisdom of his words. Wisdom? Nothing. He was a fool. Maybe not, he decided after a moment. Perhaps he had been wise. Only time would tell. He felt Farah stir some time later and was surprised to realize it was morning. Slowly he opened his eyes to discover her face staring down at his, studying him. Good morning, she whispered. He waited, thinking she might be angry at finding him in bed with her, but she revealed none of the outrage she had the morning before. Still, her eyes were clouded and her grief was evident. Did you sleep well? He asked. She nodded shyly, her gaze avoiding his. What about you? As well as can be expected. He stretched his cramped arms and yawned loudly. They were fools, the pair of them. His sister had said as much yesterday morning. They were sleeping in a single bed when there was a perfectly good king-size bed in the other room. Ali didn't have a single excuse to offer his sister and finally told her to mind her own business. But Tahira was right. Thank you, Ali, Farah said, climbing out of bed. Her face was turned away from him. For what? Staying with you? No, well, yes, that, too, but for you no, not making love to you. She nodded. Reaching inside her closet, she took out a set of clothes and held them in front of her as if to shield her body from his view. She'd spent most of the night cuddling against him. He'd felt every inch of her creamy smooth skin, there wasn't anything left to hide. It didn't seem right to point that out, however. The next few days are going to be very busy. I'll be spending a lot of my time finishing up the funeral arrangements and going through Natia's things, so we probably won't see much of each other for a while. She didn't need to sound so pleased at the prospect, Ali mused. By the time he'd showered and dressed, Farah had already left the condominium. His sister was eyeing him critically, clearly displeased about something. "What's wrong with Farah?" Tahira asked in an accusatory voice. "She looks as if she was crying." Naturally it would be his fault, Ali thought, ignoring his sister's glare. Her grandmother died, he explained, and he watched as Tahira's eyes went soft with sympathy. "You love this woman. She's my wife." He saw now that it was a mistake to have hired his sister. It was obvious that she was going to be what Salman called a damned nuisance. "You did not marry her for love." "No," he admitted gruffly, resenting this line of questioning. He wouldn't have tolerated it from anyone else, and Tahira knew it. "She knows that you did not love her. This is why she sleeps in the small bed." "Thank you, dear." "Who?" "Never mind," Ali said impatiently. He grabbed a piece of toast from the plate and didn't wait for the rest of his breakfast. He turned to leave the room. "Ali," she said sharply, stopping him. "You've become very Pakistani." Her face relaxed into a wide smile. "I think this is good. You teach me, too, okay?" "Okay," he said, chuckling. Sorting through Natia's possessions proved to be far more difficult than Farah had expected. Her grandmother's tastes had been simple, but she'd held on to many things, refusing to discard life's mementos. Disposing of her clothes was the easiest. Farah boxed them up and took them to a shelter for the homeless. It was the little things she found so difficult. A token from the Karachi World Fair, an empty perfume bottle that had long since faded. The photographs. She could never part with the photographs. Farah had no idea her grandmother had collected so many snapshots. The comical photos Natia sent Abid Chaudhry while he was away fighting in the Second World War made her smile. Farah came across a packet of pictures that caused her to laugh outright. Her grandmother, so young and attractive, was poised in a modest-looking swimsuit in front of a young soldier's photograph. It had to be Farah's grandfather, but she'd never seen pictures of him at that age. The whole thing must have been rather risque for the time. Farah guessed Natia had been giving Abid a reason to come home. Heaven knew it had worked. Farah studied the picture and sat for several minutes remembering the love story Natia had told her. It was sweet and innocent, unlike now when sex so often dominated a relationship. Except for her marriage, she thought defeatedly. It was difficult to believe she could have been married to Ali this long without making love. He'd been eager for the physical side of their relationship until she'd revealed the first signs of wanting him, too. How typical of a man. "Oh, Ali," she breathed, holding her grandmother's picture. "Will there ever be a way for us?" In her heart she heard a resounding yes. But the voice wasn't her own, nor was it Ali's. It came From Natia. The day of the funeral, Farah wore a black dress and an old-fashioned pillbox hat with black netting that fitted over her face. Farah hadn't slept well the past few nights and the fatigue was beginning to show. She'd made a point of coming home late, knowing Ali would be waiting for her. She'd mumble something about being tired and close her bedroom door, slipping into bed alone. She'd spent the past 2 nights wishing Ali was there with her. She cursed her foolish pride for not approaching him. But she was afraid that once she did, she'd ask him to make love to her again, and this time she wouldn't take no for an answer. The limousine delivered Farah, Salman, and Ali to the church where Natia had worshipped for a number of years. Salman and Ali climbed out first. Ali offered her his hand as Farah stepped out of the car. A small group of mourners had formed on the sidewalk outside the church, awaiting the family's arrival. Farah's gaze quickly scanned the crowd, then stopped abruptly. There, seeking her eyes, stood Nasir. "Good morning," the woman said, struggling with the language. "I am Tahira, Ali's sister."